Hello and welcome to the Suzanne Atwell Show. In this episode, the COVID pandemic and what happens when individual rights conflict with the common good of society. In response to an historic public health threat, we are a house divided over masks, social distancing, and vaccinations. We can't even agree on whether children in schools should follow the guidance of public health experts or a politically ambitious governor. In the past, threats of this magnitude united America. Smallpox, Spanish flu, polio. So what changed? We look for answers from three perspectives. Politics with Frank Alcock, an esteemed professor of political science at New College. Constitutional rights with Michael Barfield of the Florida ACLU. Ethics and religion with Chaplain Tom Pfaff, president of the Sarasota Ministerial Association. But first, our nation has a history of inoculations and vaccinations that dates back to the American Revolution. Everyone knows George Washington is the first president and father of our country, but few know he was also the father of American inoculation. During the American Revolution, 90% of deaths among continental regulars was the result of smallpox. In February 1777, then General George Washington made the unpopular decision to order mass inoculations for all Army regulars. In 1792, the Commonwealth of Virginia passed strict regulations for inoculation. The act included a penalty of $1,500 or 6 months imprisonment for anyone who willfully spread the smallpox virus. In 1813, the U.S. Congress authorized, and James Madison signed, an act which established a national vaccine agency. Massachusetts passed the first U.S. law mandating vaccinations for schoolchildren. And in 1905, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of mandatory smallpox vaccination programs. In spite of history, medical science, and established constitutional law, public resistance to vaccines is making herd immunity impossible, and political leaders like Ron DeSantis are exploiting COVID mandates in the name of individual liberty.
We trust people to make their own decisions in this state. We are not going to be bludgeoning people with restrictions and mandates and lockdowns or any of that stuff. It hasn't worked, obviously. It has immense costs to society, and so you're going to be able to make those decisions for yourself. And I think our job is to be able to protect your right to be able to make those decisions for yourself.
That was the governor just last week on August 28th. So, how are his hands-off, do-what-you-want policies working out for Florida? In April, he signed an order banning vaccine passports. In May, he banned businesses, schools, and government agencies from requiring proof of vaccination. A month later, in June, he allowed the statewide COVID emergency he first declared in March 2020 to expire. He sued the Centers for Disease Control in July to stop COVID safety guidelines that the federal agency had imposed on cruise ships. And in August, the most controversial and divisive COVID-related decision to date, banning K-12 public schools from requiring students to wear masks and withholding pay from local boards that defy his order. To put this in context, these executive decisions were being made at the same time infection rates were exploding in Florida, making us the worst state in the country. In Sarasota County, 1 in every 4 persons tested positive in August. That fact and the advice of healthcare professionals led our school board to courageously defy the mask ban until infection rates drop. To help us with the logic and law behind these decisions, we turn to a civil liberty advocate who understands the difference between rights and privileges. Michael Barfield. Welcome back, Michael.
Good to see you,
Yeah,
Suzanne.
it's good. Always good to see you. In a previous show that we did with you, you wisely told me, in response to a question about masks and individual rights, quote, "Yes, you have a right not to wear a mask, but you don't have a right to infect me with a potentially deadly disease," end quote. Regarding mask mandates in school, does this still hold?
Absolutely. There's always been a balancing act between individual liberties and what's good for society as a whole. Mm-hmm. And courts have repeatedly upheld the ability to quarantine individuals who have contagious diseases, and even more recently, efforts to uphold mask mandates. Mm-hmm. So it's still good law. The only thing that has changed is the politics of the question.
Well, and that goes to my next question, applying that principle, call it a principle, to mandatory vaccinations. The collective right isn't the collective right to health via herd immunity greater than the individual rights that I am not going to mask up?
The collective right is superior. It is, it's part of our basic nature as a community. And I think we've lost sense of the importance of community. And in the maelstrom of social media, with the appeals to exercising your individual rights, people don't understand that they don't have an individual right to endanger other members of the public. I mean, we could talk about the case Typhoid Mary is a great example. And the power of government is to protect society. Their responsibility is to protect society, not individual liberties when there is a pandemic and a public health threat.
But it's so hard for them to lean into that. Why is it so hard to lean into that philosophy?
Because we've entered a situation, an era where the exercise of political power is for personal gain and not for the common good.
Speaking of exercising political power, as you know, there are numerous lawsuits against Governor DeSantis' order against mandatory masks in school, not to mention to threaten to withhold salaries of our school board members, superintendents, and perhaps many others. What is the Florida ACL doing with this, and how do you feel about that? What's going on with that?
Well, how I feel about it is that, first of all, we think it's illegal for the governor to threaten a public official to exercise their discretion, threatening pecuniary harm. It's also immoral. It's just flat out wrong. And what the ACLU is doing is focusing again on the importance of voting rights and educating citizens about how to avoid getting into situations where we have someone, as we do in the current governor, spewing out misinformation, making bad decisions for the population as a whole.
Is it legal what he's doing?
I do not believe it is illegal. In fact, I believe it's a felony to threaten public officials.
Explain that.
There's a statute, corruption by threat, that if you threaten a public official in the exercise of their discretionary duties and you threaten pecuniary or other harm, it is a felony. And we believe that's why the governor backed off just last Friday in his threats to impose financial harm against school board members exercising their discretion about what's good for their community on mask mandates.
And you are recently appointed to a government center for accountability, so your involvement with that fits right into what you're saying.
Yes, one of our core mission is aiding journalists in doing investigative journalism, obtaining public records, and holding government accountable to its citizenry about what they're doing or not doing. So it's very exciting. We've worked on a few projects with dark money and campaign finance, and again, this misinformation and manipulation of the public via social media or otherwise that has gotten us into a rather critical situation.
Yeah, delve more into the social media and how it's affected all this, where we are in the world today with regard to everything, but in particular this mask and vaccination issue. What have we come to?
A state of lawlessness almost. It's social media allows anyone to be a publicist, and without any training, without any responsibility, without any ethics. And it has set us on a dangerous collision course with, I don't know what is lurking out there, but I know that it's not good. And freedom of speech, I'm an ardent supporter of freedom of speech, but it carries the same responsibility of accurate information, not irresponsible mistruths, and that is dangerous. It's akin to fire in a crowded theater. And when approximately 2,000 people are losing their lives every week in this country, that's almost the scale of a 9/11 happening every week.
Amazing. I'd like to go back to this notion of individual rights and societal rights. The founding authors of the Constitution were well aware of potential conflicts. So how did they address it at the time? Are there examples of remedies, priorities, or reconciliatory options that are noted in writing?
Yes, Jefferson, the father of our Declaration of Independence, spoke about the need for personal responsibility when exercising individual rights, and that it is never to be held to a higher standard than the common good. It is always exercised with the common good of society in perspective. So I cannot imagine that our founding fathers would think that it is appropriate to endanger public health in the pursuit of exercise of individual liberties. That is not how they defined and spoke about the exercise of individual rights.
Thank you, Michael, for putting it all in perspective for us. Of course, politics has a lot to do with what our governor is doing. Every time he picks a fight with President Biden or takes a far-right position, millions of dollars from conservative, out-of-state donors are deposited in his PAC account. To dig deeper into the politics of COVID policy in Florida, we turn to a trusted academic scholar and frequent guest on this show, Frank Alcock. Help me out here. Give us a lesson in Florida political science. Help us understand what state constitutional authority gives the executive branch, and in this case, Governor DeSantis, to bar mask mandates and at the same time threaten to withhold salaries from our school boards, our superintendents, and probably a lot more who dare to defy him. Can he do this?
It's certainly contested, and I cannot cite any authority within our state constitution that gives him the power to prohibit or preempt any action on the part of municipal government school districts to take what they view to be reasonable precautions in the name of public safety. I think historically, conservative political philosophy is such that it tries to bring power down to the lowest level of government that could, exercise it prudently. So there are certain things like national defense that should be handled by federal government, but things that can be more effectively governed by local government, that power should be retained there. And so this is a pretty big principle for conservatives, and you certainly can see it often with respect to state government arguing about Washington trying to impose their will, and you sometimes hear it in terms of local government getting angry at either the federal government or Tallahassee. We've gone through a peculiar period. I think it's been about a decade or more, at least I've been paying attention to it, where those principles have been in a way turned on their head, wherein you still hear anger, depending upon who's in the White House, at Washington, but our legislature, now our governor, has often been more and more cavalier and intentional about preempting and usurping the rights of local governments, municipality, and school district boards in order to impose what they believe to be certain types of policies that may or may not be in the best interest of the public.
But interestingly, one of the cornerstones of modern conservatism, to your last point, is states' rights over centralized federalism. So the idea that democracy does best at the local level, because we kind of know who we're voting for and what the constituency is. But that said, what is happening in Florida when we have a governor and all this intrusiveness into local public health and its policies with education? I would assume that Ronald Reagan would roll over in his grave.
What we're seeing now is quite different than what we saw in the Reagan era in terms of, there's a consistency, I think, in conservative principles and their application and governance back then. Now there's not. There is, when it's convenient, you rail at a level of government above you, but when you're looking at the state level, we see actions. They're not just limited to what we're seeing in COVID, but they're on the environment and other fronts, sometimes taxation fronts here, where a Tallahassee or state government will issue edicts that constrain the ability of local government to make some decisions on its own.
So how did we get here, and what changed? Are there societal waypoints and pivotal events that got us here, and how did that happen?
Well, I think historically, if we go back even centuries ago, there was some resistance on occasion to either wearing masks. We've had an anti-vaccination movement that has been in place for, it's been accelerating the last decade or two. And then we had our former president, played a major role in politicizing the mask issue and encouraging a lot of his followers to buy into the idea that it was somewhat symbolic that by putting a mask on or refusing to wear one said something about where your politics were, and that just took us eventually off the rails, and it's become something that it means something, the mask mandate, very differently depending upon where you are in your politics. But with respect to public health and public safety, it's about as simple could be. I don't know how bad this is going to get. The numbers are frightening. I am quite shocked myself in terms of the way that the politics have played out in this country over the last 10 years. I did not think that things could get increasingly polarized to the point where clearly a lot of folks are doing harm to this country by their rigid, polarized stances and refusing to acknowledge reality or things that we learn about reality as we move forward. And yet, that seems to work well politically for a lot of people. So it's rather depressing.
I have to agree with Frank. It is depressing and scary. We are at a uniquely precarious point in our history. Beyond the law and politics, what does a house divided say about the values and beliefs of the people who live in it? What are the ethics of not wearing a mask or getting vaccinated? To answer that, we turn to a person of profound and enduring faith, best known in Sarasota as Chaplain Tom. We've been talking about political science and civil liberties. Now we turn to ethics. When historians and theologians look back at this pandemic and the way it divided us, what will they say about our inability to unite around Christian values like do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Apply that core principle to mask mandates?
Well, I think we don't want to confuse compassion for wisdom. And our compassion calls us to action. Our compassion is 90% here and 10% here, and our wisdom hopefully is the 90% here and 10% here. So that passion calls us to action, so we must do something, but we want to be wise about it. And ethics gives us the roadmap, the rules, the ethics to tell us what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. So we want to look at what our ethics telling us. What is that roadmap saying? And you brought it up, the vision. You know, many of us have heard the saying, and I'm sure you have, that a house divided against itself can't stand. And that was our Rabbi Jesus speaking. And he said, a kingdom can't stand, a city can't stand, a house can't stand, a family can't stand. It'll deteriorate if it's divided. And I know in your work, when you were counseling families, you didn't say, well, today we're going to learn how to get divorced. We're going to learn how to alienate our teens and just have them lose. And what's going on now is that we are being pushed by forces that I hope we get into to divide the house. And so we must to understand the cause of this. I think we need to get into that. And I discovered it in a wonderful way. I was attending 3 out of the 4 town hall meetings that Dr. Asplin, our new superintendent, not so new, conducted. And the parents, of course, accolades on our school system for the majority of the time. But at the end, when you got in Q&A, they had 2 passionate moments. No more masks. Many of our board were there from the Ministerial Association, and we were more or less observers. And I was troubled and wanted to find what was behind all this divisiveness, all this negative remarks.
Again, you are the president of the Sarasota Ministerial Association,
Yeah.
and you have been for years a
Yes.
respected religious leader in our community. God knows we need leadership and prayers during the pandemic. However, has your organization taken a position on masks in schools or vaccination? And is there a consensus among members that reflects an interdenominational point of view?
Well, if you have a rabbi, a pastor, and a priest in the same, you got 12 opinions. I can tell you what our experience is. There are wonderful church men's rooms, and the center sink will be blocked off. I think it was helpful. They had the plexiglass on each side of the urinals,
Right,
and only 2 were allowed in there.
right.
Other churches, I showed up after a while. I had my goggles on.
Yeah.
I had my face mask on. I'm not sure if I was wearing gloves. I can't remember. And I walk into the gathering. Only one person had a mask on in the aisle. So what does that demonstrate? That demonstrates that the faith community gives people a choice.
As you know, of course you know, our country was founded on ideals that are closely linked to the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yes.
We are created equal, one nation under God. Love your neighbor as yourself. So help me understand how people of faith reconcile me first, but I can do what I want, individualism, with Christian values. How do you reconcile those two?
Well, I love what you were referring to, the great commandment, that we should love God. It starts out with God, with all of our person, and then we should love our neighbors as ourselves. And so when you put that mask on, that in a sense is an expression of love, because I don't want to get COVID,
That's right.
you know, so I got the mask on to protect me.
So your love
but I
is
don't-
protection.
But I don't want you to get COVID either.
Exactly.
My greatest concern, my ethical basis, the foundational principle that I'm trying to share today, and hope some will hear, is that we should do everything we can not to divide our house. And we should be aware of those forces, this thinking of we're all either an oppressor or oppressed, as opposed to brothers and sisters.
Seems like with this pandemic, there are some cracks in our core values. One of them being the failure to agree on an absolute truth that some will call secular relativism.
Yeah.
And to add to that,
Yeah.
to elaborate on that if
Yeah.
we can't agree on facts, science, ethics, what is the role of organized religion here?
One of my 4 degrees is in chemistry, and so I know science. And today we've really lost science and now have opinion.
You mention quite a bit how we're all divided. Why is that?
A very famous person said a lie told over and over will eventually become truth. And that very famous person was Vladimir Lenin. So what's behind it? I think it's a systemic desire by those who want to destroy the wonder and beauty of a great nation, to separate us, to divide us, so that we will fall.
And masks fit that. How do masks fit that philosophy?
Well, again, if I have a mask on and you don't, you are the oppressor, because you aren't loving me as yourself. You are bringing me to a point where I may get COVID.
Many church leaders have endorsed vaccines and masks. The Pope recently spoke out calling vaccines, quote, an act of love. Still, as Chaplain Tom explained, we are a house divided, and that should be a cause of concern for all of us. The state of Florida is paying a heavy price for it. The underlying social trends, politics, and cultural values that are driving this struggle between individualism and public health are nothing new. They're as much a part of the American story as Washington and smallpox. What is new is a stubborn, selfish, mean streak that political leaders are exploiting, much to the detriment of democracy. Clearly, it's time for a change. Maybe Otis Redding was right way back in 1966. How about we just try a little tenderness? Maybe that would help. For more information about COVID, civil liberties, and vaccines, go to these links, and you can always watch this show and all our past episodes on my Facebook, YouTube, and website. That wraps up another one. Hope you learned something and enjoyed the show. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you around town.